You're listening to Your Magical Midlife. This podcast is for women who are seekers, dreamers, and out-of-the-box thinkers. If you're a Gen X woman who never quite fit in, and probably never will, listen up. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and coach, and I'm here to guide you through the expansive, exhilarating, and sometimes exhausting crossroads that we find ourselves in at midlife. Whether you're a seasoned listener or just joining the adventure, think of this podcast as your hot pink convertible cruising down the highway of change. Together we'll navigate the sometimes baffling backroads of midlife and collect all the cool souvenirs along the way. Get in and buckle up. Our map may have flown out the window miles ago, but that doesn't mean we aren't going to have a blast. Let's hit the road and discover the magic just around the bend. Wiley Women is a wellness brand that wants you to live your best midlife. Developed by a naturopath, they offer tinctures, supplements, and drink mixes. Wiley uses plant medicine and clinical studies to demystify and embrace the hormonal powers and hidden complexities of grown women from the inside. Female formulated and female founded. Plus, they offer free shipping and easy returns. I love the Unworried tincture, which has bacopa, holy basil, passion flower, and reishi. It helps calm my body and stops the spinouts. It reduces jitters and lightens my mood. Go to www.wileywomen.com and use code KATEH2O at checkout to get 20% off. That's www.wileywomen.com and use code KATEH2O for 20% off. I was 38 years old when I became a burlesque performer. I had been a social worker for about a decade, and I was working at, where was I working at? I was working at NYU as a crisis response counselor, which meant that I was on call 24 hours a day, 4 days a week. I had previously go-go'd in various New York City nightlife institutions, but that had kind of petered out, and I was really looking for a way to express myself and be creative beyond the art parades that I did, like the Mermaid Parade and things like that. I was always really attracted to glamour and costumes and excitement. I was a very excitable little girl. I had wanted to be a ballerina or an actress or a performer of some kind. And I actually went to the auditions of Annie when I was 8 or 9 years old. And my mother took one look at the line and she turned to me and she said, "Listen, Katie, you're not that good. You're not that good of a dancer. You're not that good of a singer. I'm not going to stand on this line with you all day just for you to not get in the show." And she took me home. And that really makes my mom sound like a downer, but my mom really didn't want me to be crushed by not having my dreams realized. I know that now as an adult. But I had taken dance classes since I was a little kid, and my favorite day of the entire year was the day that we came into the dance studio and everybody's dance recital costumes were hanging from the ceiling. And in the 70s, which is when I was taking these dance classes, our costumes were incredibly tacky. They were basically leotards with strings of sequins sewn on them and some tulle, and they were just themed, probably like now what would be considered culturally inappropriate, like flamenco costumes and all this stuff. So that was my absolute favorite day. I looked forward to getting my costume in September when our recital was in June. And the whole year I was thinking about, like, what would our dance be and what color would our costume be and all these things. So I was always just really attracted to all things sparkly, shiny, glittery, all those things. So as a social worker, there really isn't much room for glamour. It's a pretty unglamorous job. Even when I had my high prestige job at NYU, it's still pretty unglamorous. When you think social worker, your mental image is probably a semi-disheveled middle-aged woman with a big craft brooch on, wearing some shapeless brown sack from Eileen Fisher, sitting behind a desk with piles of disorganized papers on them, which may or may not be smudged with whatever she ate for lunch. That's the stereotype. And that was not what I was ever about and not what I wanted to be. So around the time I turned 38, I started looking for a new creative outlet. And I stumbled on, well, I was already pretty obsessed with Dita Von Teese. You probably already know who Dita Von Teese is, but if you don't, she's a very glamorous woman who does these 1950s and 60s inspired classic burlesque acts with a big champagne glass prop, and she has boas. They're 4 or 5 times the size of a boa you would get at a Party City. She's a very, very glamorous woman who is just absolutely pristine in her presentation. Everything is perfect. She has a little rhinestone encrusted Playboy bunny-esque costume, and she's just phenomenal. So I was already very enamored of Dita and her world. And I came across the New York School of Burlesque, and I thought, this is my chance to pretend that I am glamorous and all those things. So I took some classes. Again, I was 38. I had no real expectation of it really going anywhere. But I made a couple of friends, and this woman invited me to be part of the troupe that she was forming. She wanted to form a classic burlesque troupe. And so the Rhinestone Follies was born. And I'd performed for 6 or 7 years, from the time I was about 38 till, let's call it 45, and then performed independently from about 45 until 49. So I performed burlesque as a middle-aged woman for 11 years. And here are my takeaways. Burlesque is supposed to be a very forgiving art. It is body positive, it is inclusive, it is gender inclusive, and it has become progressively more so since the time I started and since the time I stopped performing. When I first started, there was a couple of comments about my age, but mainly when people found out how old I was. I'm a small person, and when you're small, people knock a couple of years off of you just by sight. They assume that because you are petite, you must be 5 to 10 years younger than you actually are. I don't know if people think I'm going to continue to grow as I age or what. Or I have a particularly childlike appearance. I'm not really sure why people do this, but it seems to be a thing with every other petite person that I encounter. They always say that people guess them several years younger than they are. So there's that. But burlesque was a fairly inclusive space even back then. And nobody really left me out or didn't book me for shows because I was older. And in fact, the 2 women I performed with in the troupe were respectively 12 and 17 years younger than me. Take that in for a minute. I performed in a troupe with 2 other women who were 12 and 17 years younger than me, which means the younger one was, if I was 38, she was 31. She was 21 years old when we started. That's insane. I'm going to have to fact check that because that's so mind-blowing. I'm not even sure that's true, but I'm fairly certain that one of them was 17 years younger than me. Anyway, we got some traction because we had good costumes, we had cute choreography, and we did this sort of old-timey, old-fashioned, our name was Rhinestone Follies, and we were sort of Ziegfeld-esque, or we tried to be, although we didn't rehearse nearly enough. So we weren't, all that good. But we managed to get booked at all the retro vintage events, walking around in we called them our feather bots, which were these bustles that had the biggest ostrich plume feathers that we could source. So they were like 22-inch ostrich plume things that we put on our butt that looked like bird tails. And they were very, very glamorous, and our costumes were heavily rhinestoned. It was definitely my dance recital as an adult moment. So the Rhinestone Follies opened up other booking opportunities for me. And even though I was at this point around 40, no one seemed to notice or care. And because it's stage lighting, it's a bar, it's dark, it's a nightclub, these places that we're performing, I didn't tell anybody that I was 40, but I also didn't tell anybody I was much younger. I didn't pretend to be younger, and nor did I reveal my age. So it didn't really seem to matter at the time that I was well past the Showgirl expiration date. When I was about 45 and I had been performing roughly 7 years, by this point, I had performed all over the United States. I had performed in LA, I had performed in Cleveland, I had performed in Boston, I had performed in New Mexico. I had gotten quite some traction with this. And yes, I was still an active social worker, working at NYU and then St. Vincent's and then NYU Langone, the hospital as opposed to the school, and then an employee assistance program, and then what did I do after that? A managed care company, my first managed care company job. So all this whole time, I was living this insane double life where my job didn't know that I was a showgirl, and the showgirl community didn't know that I was a social worker, because never the two worlds shall meet. It was a very, very interesting and fun time. But it also was really stressful because leading this kind of crazy double life kind of left a wear and tear on my psyche. I knew that I was aging, and I knew my body was changing. And when I really shifted into perimenopause, I was definitely still performing. I remember a festival that I was performing at in, where the hell was I? Tennessee? I might have been Tennessee or Kentucky. It was definitely in a conservative southern state. And it was a classic burlesque festival. And I was wearing a light pink confection of a costume with my light pink feather fans. And it was like an old-fashioned, gilded, beautiful stage. And I was doing my very best backstage to get my nerves in order. And I noticed at this point, I was already in the middle of perimenopause. I was, let's say 44. And my periods had already started to get a little wonky. And I definitely had some cramping all day. But at that point, if you're in perimenopause, at that point, didn't even really mean anything. I had cramps when I was ovulating. I had cramps before I got my period. I had cramps at random times that produced no blood at all. My period came 1 month and then didn't come the next month, or came 6 or 7 weeks later. My period was already all over the map. So the cramping didn't alarm me. I stepped onto the stage in, again, my highly encrusted pink rhinestone costume. The music was going. I was in the moment. The cramping was worse. And then I reached to take off my little skirt, and I noticed I was really bleeding. And that was a horrific and horrible moment. And there was no way to cover it up. There was nothing to do. People were in the front row. Photographers were in the front row taking pictures. There was literally nothing to do but amend my act as much as possible to have the fans cover my lower body and complete to the best of my ability. I'm not sure how many people caught that I was profusely bleeding, but I'm sure somebody did. It was a moment where I realized my body was really revolting against me, and there was nothing I could do about it. And hanging on to this vision of myself as young and glamorous was really starting to become less and less plausible. And it started to become more apparent because I knew that my body was changing, my face was changing. I was not really excited to be getting Botox. I had gotten some Botox. It made me look weird. I didn't really like the way I looked. So I decided no more Botox. And then, my weight started shifting a little bit. And as much as I worked out, my body was just different. And it was clearly like not a young body anymore. Something happens with your hormones, no matter what you do. By the time you're really heading towards menopause, 47, 48, somewhere in there, no matter what you do to your body, it's not going to look how it looked. It's just not going to. And you really have to be in acceptance of that. And as much as it's a body positive, inclusive movement, and as much as they celebrate, this is going to be a tangent. The burlesque scene has this event every June in Las Vegas called the Burlesque Hall of Fame Weekend. And part of that event is they celebrate the legends. Now, the legends are women who performed in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Whoever is still alive and still able-bodied enough to get themselves to Vegas is brought out onto the stage, and they are celebrated, and some of them still perform. And some of these women are the most badass women you have ever met in your life. I had the pleasure of getting up close and personal and interacting and being with a woman named Satan's Angel who had performed in the 60s. She was a queer woman, a lesbian, but before that she had dated Elvis, she had dated Clint Eastwood. She was a firecracker. She was a lunatic, but she was lovely. And I'm so grateful that I got to encounter her, as well as April March, who was a lovely woman who at the point I met her, she must have been in her 80s. And it was just absolutely one of the most mind-opening experiences of my life to meet these women who were still so fierce and fiery in their 70s and 80s. In fact, I got to be up close and personal with Tempest Storm, another legend, and I assisted her on stage. And the night I was assisting her, she actually fell, and the whole show just ground to a halt. And I remember being on the floor with her on stage, holding her hand. I went straight into social work mode, and I had a lot of emergency room experience under my belt. So I was just sitting on the floor with her, like holding her hand, just, you're okay, you're okay. Just breathe, just breathe, just breathe. While someone called 911 and they took her off the stage. But if you are not a legend, which I definitely was not, as I started performing at 38. And so I was, pushing the edges of age at 46, 47, definitely not lining myself up to be a legend and will never be a legend in the burlesque scene. I started to feel as if I was not going to be, as a middle-aged woman, not an elderly woman being a badass on stage, but just being a regular middle-aged woman, as inclusive as burlesque is, there is a stigma to having an aging body. And as much fun as I had performing, as I got older and older, I started to feel a little self-conscious, a little not included. My bookings were not as much. If there were photos of the show, there would be 15 photos of everybody else and like one photo of me. And it wore down on me. It really did. It made me like examine my own attitudes on aging and my own aging body. And when I moved to Florida, I performed a handful of times, but because it wasn't New York City, the ageism was more obvious. And because in New York, you could really be like much more wild, and you could really push the edges of what's acceptable in society. And by the time I left New York, I wasn't doing any fancy shows anymore. I mean, let's face it, even at my pinnacle, I was probably like a B, C+ list performer. And when I was really winding down, I was mainly performing at Coney Island, which you could basically do anything at Coney Island. It didn't matter what your size, your age, your ability, your anything. Like it was, Coney Island was an anything goes venue, which I loved, because by the time I was really winding down in burlesque, I was really much more doing like neo, like rock and roll, like punk rock burlesque, and not trying to be like a pretty show pony like Showgirl, because honestly, I didn't think I could pull it off anymore realistically. And that's fine. That's fine. So when I moved to Florida, it became apparent that there really was no place for me, because even though the audience was much older, they didn't want to necessarily see an older body on stage. And ageism, I think, is the last stand. Ageism is so prevalent that I even see it in myself when I am one of the people who is pushing back against it. I notice my own internalized ageism. I'll notice it when I notice on another person their crepey neck or their flyaway gray hair. And it's something I really want to work on. It's something I know that if I'm going to help other people, I need to really resolve this in myself. So performing burlesque in my 40s really did throw a lot of light on that in myself. And now that I'm 53 and not performing at all, it's something that I'm looking back on and examining. So if I could sum this up in like a tidy little point, I'm not even sure I can, that it was a wild ride being a part-time showgirl in my 40s, but I'm really grateful to put it down. I don't have the energy to put on 6-inch heels. I don't have the gumption to strap myself into a 24-inch corset. And I don't have the energy to be out until 3, 4 in the morning anymore. So it's okay to put those things away and embrace a different kind of glamour at this stage in my life. So I'm not sure this is a coherent episode. Let's pull a card for the episode regardless. And the card for this episode is the Hangman. Okay, that's interesting. The Hangman is about the sacrifice. It's about what are you willing to give up and let go of, and what can you give up and let go of with joy. I think giving up the mantle of youth is hard, but I'm ready to let go of it, and I'm ready to just allow myself to be in the here, in the now, and as I am today. Have a great week, guys. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to Your Magical Midlife. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. You can follow me on Instagram at Your Magical Midlife. You can also check out my offerings on my website, which is www.yourmagicalmidlife.com. I offer individualized coaching for women 45 plus who are seekers, dreamers, and out-of-box thinkers. I also offer luxury retreats that include ritual, rites of passage, and ceremony for women 45 and beyond. I'd be so excited to work with you. Also, if you're feeling kind and you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star review, as it opens this podcast to a broader audience and keeps me in those pesky algorithms. Thank you so much for your partnership with me. I appreciate you. Have a great week.